Um, Robert Forrant is on the faculty at University of Massachusetts Lowell since 1994, is a distinguished university professor of history and director of the department's graduate program. Lawrence History Center board member. He's on the editorial board of Mass Benchmarks, which is a joint publication of the UMass President's Office and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. He's been principal historian on numerous projects funded by the National Endowment for Humanities, the Lowell National Historical Park, and Mass Humanities. He's worked on numerous immigration history exhibits documenting Lowell and the region's history. Books by him include The Great Lawrence Textile Strike of 1912, New Scholarship on the Bread and Roses Strike, and The Big Move, Immigrant Voices from a Mill City. He is working on 2 new books, Lowell, The Worlds and Histories of a New England Mill City, which will be published by University of Massachusetts Press, and Interpreting Labor and Working Class History at Museums and Historic Sites, under contract to the University of Illinois Press. We are beyond thrilled to have him here tonight to deliver his talk entitled The Contradiction on the Merrimack, Cotton Mills, and Anti-Slavery in Lowell. Please welcome Robert Forrant.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks, Pollard Library. Libraries are always important, but I feel like even more so in the pandemic, and as a way to communicate, give people information, lend books out, come up with safe ways to do all those sorts of things. And so the library in Lowell is an incredibly important institution, and I'm really happy to be doing this. So let me tell you what I'm going to do, and then hopefully I'll actually do what it is I say I'm going to do. I'm going to spend about 30 minutes and then leave enough time for conversation at the end to describe this interesting aspect of Lowell history, which is that the mills in the city are essentially relying on cotton. And we know, hopefully, that cotton in New England is not grown here. Cotton in New England is coming from the South and coming on the basis of the enslaved labor of millions of Africans. And that we have this interesting dynamic in the city whereby the economy depends on slavery and cotton. And yet, as the decades go on in the first part of the 19th century, before 1860 and the Civil War, there grows a really powerful, very vigorous anti-slavery movement in the city of Lowell. So parallel to this wealth being generated and all this employment being generated in the city of Lowell, we have this movement that's challenging the labor system in the South. This book, the cover of which is on the screen here, The Empire of Cotton, for people that are really interested in digging in more to the economics and the global aspect of all of this, this is really probably the best book there is, and it really sort of makes this dramatic connection with Lowell. And so here's a bit, these are some numbers. Historians like numbers and proof, and we don't like fake news, we like real stuff. And so you can see here, again, how much cotton is coming into the city in terms of, if you look across 1834, 44, 48, 58, 1858, just before the Civil War, there's a lot of cotton coming into the city on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, feeding the 52 cotton mills that are scattered around the city. And for those of you that live in Lowell or work in Lowell, when you drive around, you see some of the mill buildings that are left. Many of them have been taken down over the years, but just again, important to sort of make this factual link to how much cotton is coming in. The other thing that's important to point out is that in terms of this history, slavery is not going away. Sometimes the way this history used to be taught, some people would say, well, the Civil War really wasn't needed because slavery was going away. If you look on the far column on the right on this image up on the screen, that's actually not the case. The numbers of enslaved people are actually growing over the decades up into the startup of the Civil War. So this just gives you a really vivid sort of example here. And something in the neighborhood of 75 or so percent of all the investment dollars, all the money that gets spent in Lowell on mills and on production in the mills goes to the purchase of cotton. So again, this incredible connection. But at the same time, a good many of the churches in the city of Lowell and the ministers in the city of Lowell are actually very much involved in the anti-slavery movement in the city. In the John Street Congregational Church, which is no longer standing, but again, if you know the city, John Street, there's a sort of a vacant lot that's a parking lot for a bank now. The John Street Congregational Church sort of sat where the parking lot is now, and it was the place where several Lowellians met to form the Lowell Anti-Slavery Society in 1835. And they declared their opposition to the institution of slavery, to the slave trade, and to slaveholding. Eden Foster, the minister depicted on the slide, was one of the leading spokespersons in the city for advocating against the institution of slavery. And the Congregational Church, where he was the minister, was thought of in Lowell and referred to often in the newspapers and such as Lowell's Anti-Slavery Church. I should say, in terms of thinking about this question of slavery and anti-slavery, a lot you could be in the north of the United States, where most of the opposition to the institution of slavery occurred and where these anti-slavery societies formed. There are a variety of opinions about what it meant to be anti-slavery and what it might take to end the slave trade. And there was a range of opinions, and that range of opinions existed in Lowell as well. So there were people who were called immediate abolitionists. And these were people who followed William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the leading abolitionists in the United States prior to the Civil War, was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and was the editor of a newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison was considered an immediatist, which meant the institution should just end. Frederick Douglass would have been another person that would have been in this camp of immediate abolition. You could have had people that were considered gradual abolitionists that sort of took the position that on a date certain, let's say hypothetically 1845, everybody in the South, Africans on plantations in the South born after 1845 would be free, but their parents and grandparents hypothetically would stay as enslaved people. But that slowly, again, in terms of gradualism, this would take place. There are other people who considered themselves against slavery, called themselves abolitionists, but were for actually sending people back to Africa, purchasing people's freedom from planters, paying planters, and as a way to free, manumit enslaved people, purchasing ships, and having people return to Africa. Several presidents of the United States were very much in favor of this. James Monroe being one in Liberia. Some people were returned back. In the capital of Liberia, Monroviaville, was named after James Monroe, who had been president of the United States. So there's a range of opinions here in terms of what it means to be opposed to the institution of slavery. At the same time, while this movement against slavery is building, again, interestingly to note that one of the backbones of anti-slavery in Lowell were female mill workers. And again, it's an interesting contradiction where they're spending their days working in cotton mills, returning to the boarding houses, but many of them being actively engaged in opposition to the institution of slavery. They were very active in signing petitions and moving petitions around the city, circulating them inside the factories on occasion, calling for the end of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and also calling for no slavery in Texas when it's annexed to become part of the United States. You have a petition there, a page from one of them, and if you look, you can see Lowell on there. It's a little bit difficult to see, but Lowell has one of the largest signatures the left-hand column on that petition, about 5 cities down, Lowell is there, and there were 1,400 signatures on this particular petition, and almost all of them were women, and most of them were female mill workers. And so there was a very active movement against the institution of slavery on the part of women. In downtown Lowell in the 1830s, there was a lot of anti-slavery agitation. The Lowell Town Hall on Merrimack Street, which is now, for those of you familiar with the city, the downtown bank of the Enterprise Bank, sits on Merrimack Street, right across from St. Anne's Church on the corner of Merrimack and Shattuck Streets. And there were anti-slavery speakers in the upstairs of that building, that town hall building, on a regular basis. George Thompson, a British abolitionist, very famous British abolitionist, also a member of Parliament in Britain, was on a tour, and he ended up in Lowell in October of 1834, speaking out again in the old City Hall against the institution of slavery. Many prominent people in Lowell were very worried about the fact that Thompson, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and other people, fugitives, fleeing the South on the Underground Railroad, ended up speaking in the Old Town Hall. And they actually tried to stop these speakers and called out people to, when Thompson was going to return in December of 1834, essentially called out people to try to disrupt Thompson's talk and block him from being able to speak. Kirk Boot, the overseer of the Boot Cotton Mill in Lowell, was one of the leaders of this opposition to Thompson and others speaking in the city of Lowell. This is part of the advertisement that was in several Lowell newspapers, basically calling people to oppose his speaking in town hall. People do show up. This is a picture of what the building looked like back in the early part of the 20th century. The top windows, the double windows, is where the hall was, where people would have been speaking. And the consequence of Boot and others calling for this demonstration was that a number of people showed up in the city downtown. They rallied in front of the building on Merrimack Street, and somebody threw a huge rock up through those windows and almost hit Thompson in the head. Thompson actually picked up the rock and took it back with him when he left Lowell, and they put the rock on display in Boston at the New England Anti-Slavery Society offices with a description. This deadly missile was hurled with tremendous force at his head by one of the citizens of Lowell, in the year of our Savior Christ, 1834, of American independence. And Thompson described the people that were out there throwing the rock, as did Garrison, as seditious, and talked about these people like Boot, and called them leaders of a mob, opposed to free speech in downtown Lowell. In 1835, there was another series of large meetings in Boston, and Lowell, and Worcester, in Newburyport, in Haverhill, and Andover, and Lawrence, and many other cities, all challenging and speaking out against the institution of slavery. And once again, leading citizens of Lowell, many of them with real serious economic ties to the mills and to cotton, were in opposition to these rallies. And you can see, this is a flyer that was distributed, and you can see a list of names of several Lowellians. And again, Kirk Boot, name featured prominently there as one of the leaders of this opposition movement. And so while, again, there's this anti-slavery activity in the city, there's a pushback to it as well. Theodore Edson, the minister of St. Anne's Church, was the first president of the Lowell Anti-Slavery Society. Edson was a staunch advocate against the institution of slavery. The church itself, the rectory building, if you look at the church, which is a really gorgeous building, and again, if you're familiar with the downtown, the minister's house sat to the right of the large church. And Edson, in his diaries, talked about actually having fugitives who were on the Underground Railroad escaping the South actually stay with him for a while in the rectory of the church. And so Edson, again, was a major sort of figure here. Edson's church also accepted parishioners of color, when most Massachusetts churches during this period of time didn't. This is from Edson's diary as well. He writes this on August 1, 1838, West Indian Emancipation Day. He says that the British government had not only set an example of vast importance and of great weight, but has demonstrated the practicability of emancipation and the superior feasibility as well as desirableness of immediate over gradual abolition. So Edson would have seen himself aligned in many ways with William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and people like that. In March of 1839, and again, this is in Edson's diary, church diaries, which he kept, he documents one of the people who ended up coming to Lowell on the Underground Railroad and staying in the rectory building, the photograph, which is here. And he talks about how this person was spirited out of the South, had fled New Orleans, was caught, was returned, fled again, escaped on a steamboat out of Mississippi, got caught in Ohio, got rescued again, and eventually made his way through Pittsburgh, then Philadelphia. So you can imagine how arduous such a trip was. Taylor ended up in New York City, then Boston, then Haverhill, then Andover, and then arrived in Lowell and to St. Anne's Church and Edson. And so in the newspapers that I've been researching and reading about all of this, as I've been trying to find out more about this, there are a significant number of fugitives who end up making their way to the city. Interestingly enough, this is a building on Dutton Street. Back in the 19th century, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, this was known as Mechanics Hall. This building now on Dutton is where Community Teamwork Inc. has some of its programs. But back in the 1830s, it was built by machinists, mechanics who worked at the Lowell Machine Shop just down the road behind where the National Park is today. And they built this building as a training facility and as a meeting hall for trainees, for mechanics, machinists who were learning the trade. And they had meetings in the upper floors where those double windows are on the top. But on the ground floor, on the Dutton street level, they had a number of businesses in those storefronts. And those shops were oftentimes operated by fugitives from slavery who ran barbershops, fruit stands, newspaper stores, other sorts of small businesses on the street level where those windows are. It doesn't quite look like that anymore. There was a fire at one point, and so the building's been changed. But this was another one of these really interesting and important spots in the city. And most Lowellians knew, and this is going to matter for sort of the wrap up of my remarks in a couple minutes. This is important to realize that many people in Lowell, probably not everybody, but many people in Lowell knew that the folks who were operating these businesses on the ground floor were indeed fugitives, had escaped from the South and had escaped the institution of slavery. This is what the building looks more like today. For anybody out taking a walk on Dutton Street or parking in the parking lot behind the National Park, if you look across the street, this is staring you in the face. This is the upstairs of Mechanics Hall. Back in the 19th century, fundraisers for the Underground Railroad would have been held here, speakers, concerts to raise money for the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass would have spoken in this room a number of times, as would have a number of other fugitives. Again, this was a really critically important place. I found this photograph of the building in this old, there's this collection of history journals that people in Lowell who were fascinated by the city's history in the late 19th, early 20th century started this, what they called the Old Residents Historical Association. And they have these great articles on Lowell history, and the collection of these is in the Center for Lowell History downtown, at least the ones I was looking at, and I was really happy to find this photo of what this would have looked like. This is another spot where there were New England-wide, Massachusetts-wide anti-slavery conventions. This is the old train station, which was downtown. Again, if you're familiar with Lowell and the city at all, there's this sort of, on Merrimack, corner of Merrimack and Dutton, there's this stone archway now, and you wonder sometimes, like, why is that archway there? It's to represent the building that had been there. There's also that big old train engine sitting on the corner there as well. But this building at the top floor was Huntington Hall. And this as well had a really important connection to anti-slavery. So the downtown, if you think about what I've been describing, the St. Anne's Church, Old City Hall, Mechanics Hall on Dutton, and now Huntington Hall, all critical key places in where this anti-slavery activity occurred. Also, again, as I mentioned before, women mill workers, very engaged, very involved. There was a newspaper that got started in Lowell in the 1830s called The Voice of Industry. It was edited by a woman named Sarah Bagley, who had been a mill worker in Lowell and the masthead of the newspaper. And in the first issues of the paper, they talked about abolitionism and being opposed to slavery. Things are going to come to a head in Lowell and in the country as a whole in 1850. And I want to finish with this story, and then we'll throw it open for conversation. As the 19th century progressed, increasingly people were escaping from the South. Enslaved people were making their way out, freedom seekers, figuring out how to get out of the South and make their way north. And Southern planters and their political representatives in Congress wanted to try to figure out if it was possible how to stop this flow of people out of the South. And eventually a whole series of laws gets passed in 1850, historians refer to as the Compromise of 1850. One of the pieces of legislation is the Fugitive Slave Law. And the Fugitive Slave Law is going to be an attempt to make it a federal crime to aid or assist any fugitives who are fleeing the South. So in other words, if you're a Lowellian in 1851, and you know that in that building on Dutton Street or in some other buildings on Central Street or wherever, there are fugitives running hair salons, barbershops, fruit stands, markets, whatever it might be, you now have a responsibility, an obligation under federal law to turn those people in, to basically rat them out to magistrates in the city who can then listen to a representation about whether indeed these are fugitives or not. The person being challenged as a fugitive, as a freedom seeker, has no ability to testify on their own behalf. And the federal magistrate basically is paid if in fact they return somebody to the South. So the law now in effect makes everybody in Lowell, if you will, complicit should they go by this law. And there are going to be fines. The federal government is going to charge people a fine if they refuse to turn people in. So public officials, if they don't do their due diligence and find people and turn them in and return them to the South, are subject to a $1,000 fine, the equivalent of about $30,000 today. Private citizens who aid fugitives, somebody like Edson or the other people we've been speaking about for the last little while. They can go to jail for up to 6 months. As I said before, a suspect can't testify on their own behalf. There's no judge, there's no jury, there's no testimony. And if a commissioner returns somebody, they get paid $10. If they set somebody free, they get paid $5. So the deck is heavily stacked here. And this does in fact begin to happen. Slave catchers begin showing up in New England. They show up in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Rochester, New York, in other places, and people are fugitives or snatched off the street. Sometimes free blacks who were born in the North, were not enslaved at all, are just snatched up, and because they can't testify on their own behalf, they're in fact rounded up in these dragnets and returned to the South. There are several really famous cases in Boston where people are rounded up, snatched off the street, and sent back south. This vigilance committee gets set up in Boston, trying to warn people. There's a flyer here, a poster that would have been posted around like this in various cities, warning people that slave catchers were seen in the area, that they were looking for people, and be sure to hide people away. Basically, people were violating federal law by not turning people in. In Lowell, one of the people that slave catchers come looking for is this guy, Nathaniel Booth, who's a barber. He's born into slavery in Virginia. He escapes, he ends up in Lowell. He's working in the mechanics block in a barber shop for a while. Also, another gentleman by the name of Edwin Moore shows up. He's running a barber shop on Merrimack Street. These are newspaper ads for their shops. And again, they're well known in the city. When the fugitive slave law gets put into effect, they leave Lowell. They go to New Hampshire for a while, and then they and a number of other people leave Lowell, leave Massachusetts, and end up going to Canada. They're fearful that they'll be turned in and sent south. In Lowell, this abolitionist movement that's been building in the city, the leaders of it call for a big meeting at Lowell City Hall. And at this meeting in October of 1850, people basically pledged to not turn people in, to provide sanctuary in Lowell, and to not let slave catchers show up in Lowell and take people off the streets of the city. And they asked that people like Booth come back because they will be protected in the city. And Chauncey Knapp, who's pictured here, sort of makes this motion in the form of a pledge that we be willing to suffer death rather than let a fugitive slave be caught when it's in our power to prevent it. So this is very powerful. And again, this is in full-on violation of federal law. Man-stealers show up in Lowell. This is a little story that appears in one of the Lowell newspapers, the American Citizen, and they're looking specifically for Mr. Booth. So again, this is very real, and this is a challenge for the city. Booth and other people are protected. The slave catchers show back up in Lowell. The Theodore Edson, Linus Child, who's an overseer in now the boot mill in Lowell in 1851, he and other people help raise money, and they basically pay the slave catchers to leave the city and leave Booth alone. And they in essence, in a way, purchase his freedom. So in the end, nobody is taken from the city of Lowell. Lowell is, using today's terminology, can think of Lowell as a sanctuary city, if you will. Fugitives continue to come. This is a newspaper article on the screen on the left-hand side that's in the Daily Citizen in January of 1859. Fugitives had stayed in the city for a while and are now moving on, a husband and a wife and a child. And so again, it's common knowledge, and bumping up against cotton is this very viable, very vibrant anti-slavery movement that includes women and men, includes fugitives who are involved heavily people like Frederick Douglass, and others who are in the city on a regular basis. This is a sign which maybe you've seen or not. If you're in the downtown, it's sort of hidden away kind of in Lucy Larcom Park, but it's sort of on the side of where St. Anne's Church is, talking about this activity in the city. We are now with the park, I've been working with them over the summer to try to get these sites that I just spoke about recognized. There's a National Underground Railroad network that the National Park System operates, and we're trying to get these sites that I just described as recognized with signage and such as these key places in support of fugitives and in support of the Underground Railroad. So hopefully that will happen and more of this history will be visible on the streets of the city in the near future. We should hear anytime whether this gets approved or not by the park system. We're hoping that it will. But again, all these sites that I spoke of have been nominated. And with that, I will stop screen sharing, and we're now going to go as live as we're going to go.
So again, folks, I'm going to ask you to stay on mute, but if you have questions, if you could please write them in the chat window, and we'll read them out to Bob. While people are forming their questions, I wonder if you could talk maybe a little bit more about the overlap of the labor movement and the abolitionist movement in Lowell.
The fact that Mechanics Hall very much is involved, and that again, these guys who are probably in terms of Lowell, the people that work at the Lowell machine shop are probably the most skilled workers in the city at the time. They're building the textile machinery that's going to be employed in the mills in the city. And they build a Mechanics Hall, and they're fully aware that they're leasing out, if you will, renting, providing space for fugitives. And so there's a real serious link there between these workers, and as well the young women who work in the mills. Now, I should say it's not everybody, right? Not every single young woman working in the mills in Lowell is involved with the female anti-slavery society, but a goodly number of them are. And so what's interesting is, so somebody like Linus Child, who I mentioned as being one of the people that helps Nathaniel Booth keep from being snatched and such. Child is an overseer in the boot mill, and he and other overseers are very much okay with women mill workers circulating petitions and doing things as opposed to slavery. But if those same women try to do things around agitating for more money for working in the mill or for shorter hours, they get fired. And so it's a really, I mean, for a historian, right? It's like, it's an interesting story to understand and teach and tell, because these guys who get cotton from the South fully know where it's coming from, are overseeing and managing the production of cotton cloth, letting their workers be openly anti-slavery in many ways. And yet when those same workers agitate for better wages, they could be fired. But the Voice of Industry, that newspaper, is constantly having stories in it about anti-slavery. Also, the poet John Greenleaf Whittier shows up in Lowell in the early 1840s, and for a while he edits an anti-slavery newspaper in Lowell, which has a lot of stuff about the mills in it, but also anti-slavery. It's called the Middlesex Standard. I actually went to the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester and read all the issues of the Middlesex Standard. Just, I mean, it only lasted for a couple years, but it was very influential at the time. And the poet John Greenleaf Whittier was in Lowell, and Sarah Bagley was editing the Voice of Industry, and Whittier was editing the Middlesex Standard in the same building in downtown Lowell. So I often fantasize that they hung out. They went to Brewed Awakening for coffee or something, you know.
Yeah.
As the 19th century progressed.
I'm impressed that the mill owner was supportive of the idea of, well, at least, openly of abolition, because there'd be an economic impact on his bottom line if, you
Yeah.
had to pay for the people to harvest the cotton.
Well, a lot of the mill overseers in Lowell happened to be Quakers, and
Okay.
Quakers were, so the predilection for the Quaker faith was to actually be opposed to slavery, and a lot of the key people that were in the upper South that were conductors on the Underground Railroad and such were Quakers. And so a lot of people brought that with them to Lowell. And again, this interesting contradiction, right? Which
Yeah,
again, for a historian is like the meat of like what we like to like try to figure out how to pull apart.
great. We have a couple questions from the audience. From Sarah Kuhn. Bob, could you talk about slaveholding in Massachusetts and the North generally? We think of slaveholding as particularly Southern, but there were many slaves in the North. For example, Royal House in Medford.
Right. So all the New England states. There's records in all the New England states of there being slavery. The New England states all by around, I'm blanking a little bit, but by around 1810, 1806, 1810, all the New England states have made slavery against state law and have essentially ended slavery in the New England states. But definitely right. I mean, for people that want to learn more about slavery in the North, the Royal House is an incredible historic site to go to. They've restored what it looked like. Boston had a considerable number of enslaved people working as housekeepers, doormen, cooks. So lots of the fancy people on Beacon Hill and lots of the fancy rich people on Comm Ave that lived in the cool estates, right? If you walk around Beacon Hill on the top and the downside toward the Common, there's still all those really fancy buildings. The backside of Beacon Hill is where large African population lived. And they basically then went to work each day as housekeepers and maids and childcare workers and such for really rich white people on the top of Beacon Hill. And that neighborhood actually became very involved in trying to protect fugitives when the fugitive slave law went into effect. At one point, several people on the backside of Beacon Hill actually broke somebody who had been caught out of jail and hid him out on the backside of Beacon Hill, and he never got caught. They basically a mob broke him out of jail, spirited him to the backside of Beacon Hill, for people that know Boston, the Mass General side of Beacon Hill. They hid him away in the little tiny side streets there, and he never got caught. So there was a very active movement in Boston for sure.
Yeah, and I would say too, our nonfiction book club for the library recently read a book called New England Bound: Slavery and Colonization in Early America by Wendy Warren,
Mm-hmm.
which was really fascinating and something that I didn't realize about slavery in the North. And it started early, but it included natives who got shipped to Europe in part of the slave trade. So it was like the part of the triangle trade that Native Americans were, shipped out to be slaves over there. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, for people that are listening and are interested, I don't know, I think actually the Royal House is open on some schedule now with obvious social distancing and masking and such, but you can just Google and go to the Royal House, to their website. There are a lot of photographs, and there's a lot of history on their site. They also have lots of talks, lots of lectures historians are giving from time to time. So for people that want to pursue this history more, they're a good place to like bookmark on your desktop to stay in touch with what they're up to.
From Marie Frank, where were there certain neighborhoods in which African Americans lived in Lowell?
Yeah, so great question. There's a neighborhood, it's not there anymore, but the neighborhood was up off, again, for people that don't know Lowell, it's hard to explain. But there's definitely a neighborhood that was, if you imagine being in Lowell now on Merrimack, you turn right onto Central and you drive Central like you're going to the connector. As you go out Central Street to around where the Registry of Deeds building is and the courthouse on the right-hand side, to the left, that was the neighborhood where lots of fugitives lived, and where as well free blacks who were living in Lowell at the time also lived. That's now a shopping plaza. That neighborhood got urban renewed out of existence in the 1960s and early 1970s. A Zayre's department store got put in there for old-time Lowellians, and that area, and so that neighborhood got demolished. It's actually unfortunate because Douglas, Garrison, several fugitives, lots of really important historical figures. George Thompson, when he came to Lowell, they all stayed in that neighborhood, either living in that neighborhood when they came to town. And it would have been nice to at least preserve even one building, that people could do something with, but the neighborhood just really got demolished. Basically, there's just nothing there anymore.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, I think Lowell's Opera House was in that neighborhood too. Anyway, from Christopher Jenkins, how seriously were petitions with the signatures of women to public officials taken in an era when they could not vote?
Yeah, I mean that's obviously a problem, right? That because women couldn't vote, what's the impact? And it's hard to know. I mean, I think I look at the petitions and I look at all this stuff in Lowell as a way to take the temperature of how lots of people felt about the institution of slavery. And my interest in the petitions is that people like William Lloyd Garrison in The Liberator and Douglas in his newspaper, The North Star, and other people commented when these petitions were signed at how many signatures there were from Lowell mill workers. And they were really impressed with how vibrant the movement was in the city of Lowell. Do I think any of these petitions actually influenced legislation? Probably not. But I don't think in the 1830s, 1840s in the House and Senate in Washington, D.C., they were not hearing anything about limiting slavery. Nobody was entertaining ending it or confining it where it was. And so the contention was, as the country expanded, where slavery was going to go, hence the Texas petition. There were hundreds of thousands of signatures from people all over the country about not letting Texas come in as a slave state. People worried that the balance would be tipped politically in the House and the Senate, and even more people in the House and Senate would be pro the institution of slavery as the century progressed. By the early 1850s, it's becoming obvious that there's sooner or later going to be some kind of a showdown. And the more new states that come into the country as slaveholding states, that means then those senators, those people in the House of Representatives are going to obviously be pro-slavery, which would make ending slavery in some capacity politically almost impossible to take place. And again, the best example of that is the fugitive slave law. There's not enough anti-slavery representation in the House and the Senate and the White House at the time to prevent this law from being put into play. People argued against the fugitive slave law as basically saying you're forcing people. So the way a lot of people dealt with this is that's a Southern problem, right? A lot of people in Lowell dealt with the institution of slave. Well, that's got nothing to do with us. It's in the Constitution. It's not illegal. That's got nothing to do with us. But when the fugitive slave law is passed, it essentially calls the question in the North. It says, okay, now, where do you stand? Are you for or against? We now know there are fugitives living in the city of Lowell. We know there are fugitives living in Haverhill. We know there are fugitives living in Andover. We know there are fugitives living in Lawrence. Are you going to turn them in? Or are you going to violate the federal government? What are you going to do? And so the fugitive slave law actually, in a way, helps to call the question and make it a much more present issue in the North. People can't avoid it. It's like staring them in the face. Each time somebody is picked up off the street, it's a headline in the newspaper. And so now this really puts the North on notice as having to, okay, what are you going to do? You can't ignore it anymore. Are you going to be a rat? Are you going to return people to the South? Or are you going to violate federal law, knowingly violate federal law? And that becomes this big tension in Lowell.
That's fascinating. I wonder too about abolitionists, whether or not it was like what percentage of the population was for that and whatnot. I think about the whole silent majority idea. Like, if was Lowell mostly trying to just stay out of it and take care of their own business, and they were just like Lowell
Yeah.
became a flashpoint because of what it represented in taking the cotton and turning it into textile.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think. I mean, it's difficult. People try to figure out like what's the percentage of people in the North that were opposed, right? I think a lot of people were silently opposed, right? But as long as it didn't hit them in the face, they weren't going to do anything, right? And they just assumed that it just stayed away and they could just live their lives. And if you were a Lowellian and it didn't hit you in the face, it didn't hit you in the face. I mean, if we think about sort of our contemporary politics and violence, in the contemporary against African Americans, around the country, right, all summer long. If it doesn't happen across the street, do you actually care? And so for lots of people, I don't think it mattered, but I do think in Lowell, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, this meeting downtown in 1850, after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, there were 1,500 people packed into the second floor of Old City Hall, and the street was full of people as well, who the fire marshals wouldn't let in because people were blocking the stairways. The room was entirely packed. And Lowell's not that big of a city at that point. So 1,500 people, plus the people out on the street, that's a goodly percentage of Lowellians who show up at this meeting. I mean, the active members of, let's say, the Lowell Anti-Slavery Society might have been 250 or 300 people. There are membership lists in the Center for Lowell History, and you can look and you can see the occupations of who these people were and such. So it wouldn't have been massive numbers of people. But, as much as there could have been a silent majority that sort of favored letting slavery be where it was, there were any number of people that were opposed and thought it was not a good thing. But again, when push came to shove, rallied and showed up as in opposition to slavery. I mean, Lowell's one of the first places for, Dakota, all this history on the Ladd Whitney Memorial in front of the City Hall by the library. I mean, Lowell is one of the first cities that musters troops to head south when the war is going to begin. And there's this feeling in the area of being opposed, and so you do get this massing of troops. You have Benjamin Butler, one of Lowell's favorite sons or not, depending on who you talk to, organizing and mustering the troops to head south, right? And the other thing about Lowell that's key here and that's interesting is as the abolition movement grows in Lowell, the South takes notice. And so there are articles in Southern newspapers, in Richmond and other places, sort of warning Lowell to mind their P's and Q's, and maybe in order to let Lowell know which side they ought to be on, maybe we'll stop cotton coming to Lowell for a while. And basically, economically, in a way, threatening the lifeblood of the city and saying, look, we know what you all are up to there. Get your city under control, you guys. Stop letting these crazy anti-slavery people run rampant in the city of Lowell. And so there are these articles, and they also threaten to stop buying cloth, because a goodly amount of the cloth that's produced in the mills in Lowell ends up being purchased by Southern plantation owners to turn into clothing for enslaved people. And they said, well, maybe we'll buy that cloth somewhere else. We'll show those Lowellians if they think they can squeeze us. We can squeeze them way more than they can squeeze us by cutting off the cotton. And so that happens all the time as well.
It's all fascinating. I have one last question, and I don't see any others from the chat, so maybe we can wrap it up with this. But I wondered if there was any research or knowledge about routes that fugitives might have taken to Lowell. I know that New Bedford was a hotspot, not only because people they could escape via sea and then escape overseas. I wonder if there's a connection between Lowell and New Bedford, or if there's any other, like routes outside of Lowell that brought, escaped slaves to Lowell.
So there's actually, I had it as a slide and then I took it out so I wouldn't have as many slides, but I found a map. American Antiquarian Society, again, has this old map that was done in the 1880s that recreates the routes that people took out of the South. And it's kind of like what the Underground Railroad sort of looked like, the geography of it. And lots of people that ended up sort of coming to Lowell and Newburyport. So in a lot of people ended up in Newburyport, getting there on ships, either stowing away or working on a ship and then getting out in Newburyport and then going about their way. The same way, as people would have got to New Bedford, right? New Bedford actually had significantly more fugitives than Lowell, partly because people could make their way there, as you said, by the sea. The description in Edson's diary is a fairly typical route people would have taken from Virginia, from North Carolina, and places like that. So the closer you were to, in the South, the closer you were to the coast, the more likely you would either try to get away on a ship, or you would move your way up through Virginia, and then you would end up in Maryland. You might be in Baltimore, and then you would get to Philadelphia, and then New York. And so people that made their way to Lowell, that the one case we know of for sure in Edson's diary, that's how that person moved. They went to New York. They were in New York a while. Then they went to Boston. And so what happened is people like William Lloyd Garrison and other people sort of would help spirit people. They knew where safe, they basically knew where, what we would think, I don't know if they used this terminology back then, but what we would think of now as safe houses, right? Places where people could go and be protected. And so if Garrison was in New York, if fugitives were in New York, somebody would get in touch with him and say, where can they go in Boston? And then he would do whatever he would do. Obviously, they didn't have internet, but he would do whatever he would do and let people know they were coming. And people would end up in Boston, and maybe from Boston to Andover or Newburyport or wherever, and then eventually to Lowell, or maybe from Newburyport up along the coast into the Maritimes and disappear up that way into Canada. And so a variety of ways, right? If you were escaping the Underground Railroad and you were more in sort of not the coastal South, but more inland, you would end up in places like Ohio. Like Oberlin College, which is still around, but in Ohio, Oberlin College was a known hotbed of abolitionism, anti-slavery, and lots of people would basically escape up that way through and head up that way straight up through Ohio and then into Michigan that way, Wisconsin, whatever, out. Either stick around or go up into Canada that way.
That's great. So we're just past 8 o'clock, and I don't see any other questions in the chat. I hope you do get funding and approval for that Underground Railroad walking tour, because that should be really fascinating, and I'm sure people are looking for new and interesting routes to take outside. A lot of thanks to you, and congratulatory messages in the chat. And yeah, just want to say thank you, Bob. This has been really, really great, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your sabbatical.
Yeah, my pleasure. I obviously miss doing the walks and things, and so this is like my no walk outlet. So I'm glad everybody, as many people could show up. Oh, Lucy the history dog, great.
Yeah.
We'll have to meet up again. I'll have to meet up again with Carrie and Lucy at Warp and Weft sometime soon. But yeah, no, I think we all miss that activity around the park and all those Saturday walks and things. And so I have like this pent up, like, I need to talk to people, right? I can't sit on the hill and like not talk to people. And so it's driving me crazy. So I'm really happy when I suggested, could I do this? You right away said, yeah, let's do it. I'm really appreciative of the library doing all that. So everybody be well, wear your masks, vote, please vote. Although Massachusetts isn't going to change the world, we already know sort of what's going to happen in Massachusetts. But still vote, the numbers are going to count. And hopefully I'll see you around the block sometime soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. I hope
Take care, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.